Hello, welcome to the London School of Theology and our research conference. It's great to have our conference this year. This is a conference that was arranged for last year, and sadly, because of COVID, we had to postpone it. And of course, it's a virtual conference this year, but we're delighted with the people that are presenting papers. Thank you so much for tuning into this conference, and we hope you enjoy it very much indeed. We have something of a science theme this year, which is really exciting for a science and theology conversation. And I really want to welcome you to that. We're delighted that London School of Theology has been chosen to be part of the Science for Seminaries project that's run from Durham and York universities. And so I'm really pleased that this aligns with that development. But this is a conference that was arranged well before we knew about the Science for Seminaries opportunity. So it's a kind of happy coincidence, really, or we might say it's providential. We've got a great lineup, and I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Andrew Steen. But before I talk about Andrew, I'd like just to pray and commit this conference to the Lord. So let's pray together. Father, we want to thank you so much for this day. We want to thank you for your presence in our lives. We want to thank you for LST and the work that it does. And our research, Lord, we're thankful for the research that goes on here. But we're also really grateful for how we can connect with researchers around the world. And in particular, at this particular conference, we want to thank you for the scientists that we are talking to and the theologians that we are talking to. And we're grateful, Lord, for their input into our thinking. We want to commend the day to you, Lord, and ask that you be with us in our conversations. For we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So our first and keynote speaker is Professor Andrew Steen. I should perhaps say that if you have any questions, and this is live streamed on YouTube, please do use the chat section in YouTube to type in your questions. They will come through to us, and we'll be able to address them both at the end of Andrew's talk and in the plenary as well. So feel free to raise questions as we go along. So back to Andrew. Andrew was born in Bath in England and educated in school at Oxford, but also Oxford University, and graduated in physics and completed a DPhil thesis on laser cooling of atoms in 1991. He's had various jobs at Oxford, at Merton College, and at St Edmund's Hall as well, but he's also been a postdoctoral fellow in Paris. So he's had a variety of posts, but was made professor in 2002 and is a member of the physics department at Oxford. He's also held some visiting lectureships, the University of California in Santa Barbara in 1996, and also in the University of Innsbruck and the University of Ulm in 1999 and 2006, respectively. There's so much I could say about Andrew. He's quite a very eminent scientist and has been involved in a lot of high-level committees, advisory groups, and lots of things. And he's also received some prizes as well, which is no surprise, given the work that he's done, in particular the Maxwell Medal and Prize of the Institute of Physics in 2000. His recent book on science and humanities, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. But Andrew also teaches in Sunday school groups, which I'm really pleased to hear about. Yesterday I was listening to a talk about Messy Church doing science. I don't know if Andrew's had any involvement in Messy Church doing science in his Sunday school work, but that's good to see. Married to Emma, and they have 3 children. So it's a real delight to have Andrew. Andrew has submitted a background paper on the role of science in the avenues of understanding and appreciating nature. So I hope you've been able to have a look at that. And the title of his paper today is "It Keeps Me Seeking: The Invitation from Religion, Science and Philosophy." So without further ado, let me hand over to Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Now, I am going to just speak, and I'm sure you'll point out to me if there's any difficulty with the signal and the sound and so on. But I would like to begin by saying a big thank you to Mark and all the other organisers for inviting me to speak. I'm very pleased to be able to join in. I hope that what I will say now will be helpful to us all. I'm speaking from a script which I have prepared, and I'll be showing some visuals on PowerPoint. So I'm going to now see if I can make the technology, switch to showing the PowerPoint presentation. Just give me a moment. Okay, so I'm not able to do it yet. Maybe it will come soon. Yeah, I've not got the option to do screen sharing at my end just now. So is there any way that can change? Okay, that's come up with screen sharing. Now, I hope you're seeing a view of a title screen there with It Keeps Me Seeking, the invitation from religion, science and philosophy. Excuse me while I click back a bit. Now, I would like to be able to see two things at once. Just give me a moment. Okay, I apologize for this. I'm not quite able to do the two things I want to do. Okay, never mind. I'll just speak from the presentation. Now, the title that I've adopted for the talk is also the title of a book which I co-authored with Hans Halvson and Andrew Briggs with this title, It Keeps Me Seeking. And there's the three of us, myself on the left, Hans in the middle, Andrew on the right. Andrew Briggs and myself are scientists working in Oxford University. Hans is a philosopher working in Princeton. And so the book was aimed at a readership that we hope will include people from all sort of backgrounds, places of commitment to ideas. That's why we cast the title in that fairly broad way. And yeah, so the talk I'm giving you today is informed by some of the themes of that book. But I also will be bringing in some material from this other one, which Mark was good enough to mention earlier, called Science and Humanity. That's a slightly more in-depth look at what science is, how it sort of functions. Yeah, so that one will inform, broadly speaking, the first half of my talk, and then the other one in the second half. Okay, so here is an outline. I begin with discussing the nature of scientific description. Then I'll turn to my second major theme, which will be the relationship between Christian commitment and science. And then I'll come to some briefer comments where I'll just make some brief observations in these four areas: faith and uncertainty, miracles, cosmological origins, and evolutionary biology. Okay, so first of all then, part one, the nature of scientific description. I begin with an illustration which is good to think about in terms of an ordinary bridge made of stone. So here's a picture of a bridge with, as you see, arched bridge with stones and presumably between the stones some mortar. So if one wanted to understand the nature of this bridge and come to a complete description and understanding of what such a bridge is, one approach would be to look at the materials from which it's made. So you would look at the stones and the mortar, and you could come to a very thorough analysis of what stones are. You could think about their solid nature, their strength under compression. You could note also that once you've got all the stones and the mortar, there isn't anything else in this bridge, that's it. So one might begin to think that once you have an understanding of stones and what they are, you have thus arrived at a complete and thorough description of a bridge. The description in terms of stones somehow captures everything. It's a complete description, because after all, there is nothing else there but stones and mortar. So that point of view is in fact mistaken. And why is it mistaken, or how can I argue that it is? Well, I could just put it to all of us that you could equally well have a bridge made out of some other material, such as wood or iron or steel. And of course, what's important here is that there's a similar shape involved. And what you begin to see when you realize that bridges can indeed be made of a variety of materials, what you realize is that the global properties of the bridge, the overall way in which it distributes force, are to do with its overall shape and things like that. It's to do with properties of a bridge which are there somewhat independent of the materials from which the bridge is made. Not utterly independent, and yet not totally simply following from the materials, in the sense that the following, you could even go so far as to say the following: even if all bridges in the whole universe happen to be made of stone, it would still be false to say that only understanding the nature of stone never quite gives you a grasp of an insight into what a bridge really is. It's only when you get an understanding of the other parts, the way that the shape influences the forces, that you see the bridge in another way, at another level. And of course, the full understanding involves both. It's not a question of either or, it's very much both. But it is true to say that you can't miss out one or other of these ways of looking at the object of study. Okay, so that is my illustration and an example. And you can imagine now that how I will then proceed with this. I'll of course now generalize and apply this more generally to science. So what I'm going to do next is show you this picture of the structure of scientific explanation, which I'll first show you an idea which is wrong, and then I'll replace it with an idea which is right, or at least much closer to the truth. So the idea which is wrong, which I think a majority of scientists will probably realize that this is wrong quite quickly. But nevertheless, a large number of people in everyday walks of life probably have this picture sort of implicitly in their thinking, whether they realized it or not. And it's this notion that if we can understand the basic bits and pieces of the universe, the science of physics, then that's enough to explain chemistry. Somehow physics explains chemistry. And then chemistry in turn explains biology. And you have this sort of ladder or tower. And then biology basically explains everything else. That all of human culture becomes a sort of an afterthought or a froth living on the top of biology. Of course, you might say that's a bit of an exaggeration, but this overall picture is somehow lurking in people's imagination, never perhaps fully thought through. So let me now replace it with a better picture. So what you see now is still an oversimplified picture, but it just includes some of the big areas of science. So I picked physics, chemistry, and biology to stand in for all the various areas which one might pick. I've said a bit about poetry, art, music, law, history. Of course, I'm not even attempting to do justice to any of those subjects. But my aim is to really, in this diagram, to give two thoughts. One, the notion of a network. So it's not a tower, it's more like a network of interacting ideas. And also to look at the nature of the links in this network. Now, I hope you can see I've labeled them by the word supports on this arrow going in one direction, and another word, enarches, going in the other direction. And that's a word I've just sort of invented for the purpose of showing that the relationship is somewhat like the relationship that I discussed when I looked at the relationship between a bridge and the stonework. And you see at the top and bottom of my diagram, I've just included the words glorious mystery as a way of just alluding to the fact that ultimately we don't have a thorough understanding of what it is that enables there to be a physical world in the first place. And again here, we don't have a thorough understanding of what all of our efforts at looking at artistic, moral appreciation, our attempts to understand how life ought to be lived. We don't altogether understand what our life is all about. And there's another glorious mystery there. And of course, for me, those two glorious mysteries are not two, but one. But in any case, I felt that was a good way to leave that question or that acknowledgement on the diagram. Okay, so let me now look at those links that I labeled by the words supports and enarches. So the relationship between physics and biology then, one might say that physics is the study of all those bits and pieces of the world which can physically embody an expression of biology. Okay, so biology, obviously, the study of living things. And then the word I want to now sort of unpack a little is this word I coined in Archer. So what's biology doing? It's exhibiting structure and behaviors that make sense in their own terms. So before we even needed any physics at all, the sorts of concepts that come up in biology, concepts such as metabolism, immune system, reproduction, all these concepts make sense in their own terms, irrespective to some extent of physics. But they are nevertheless possible within the framework of those sorts of things which physics can support. So there's this two-way relationship. And the main point here is to say that to a large degree, biology doesn't necessarily need physics. I mean, you can get the Nobel Prize in biology while being, having a very limited understanding of, quantum field theory or gravity or the sorts of things which you would need if you want to get a prize in physics. So this is just to remind us all of things that are reasonably familiar, but worth thinking about, worth dwelling on and unpacking a little. Okay, so that's the end of my first part, and I just want to sort of reflect a moment on another aspect which I didn't at the moment bring out by means of my diagram, but I think it's worth adding that in the course of the last few hundred years, when scientific knowledge has sort of developed at increasing pace, at various times it seemed as if the universe might be a sort of huge machine, as if at each step in its development, what happened next was completely followed on from in a one-to-one relationship with what happened just before. So this is the notion, of course, we call determinism. So back in the 18th or 19th centuries, broadly speaking, it sort of looked as if maybe the universe was a deterministic machine. Well, the picture now is different. The picture now is much more subtle. And although there is a range of opinion in the fundamental sciences, especially in physics, which where I'm sort of coming from, there is a bit of a range of opinion, but it is now a very respectable view and a very reasonable view to hold that the world is not quite so thoroughly sort of locked into one path as it might have seemed in the past. So again, this is not something anyone knows for sure, but it seems to me that it's very reasonable to say there's a certain openness in the development of the physical world, that how it goes from one moment to the next is open to a range of outcomes. And that's also, I think, a very profound observation about the nature of the physical world. Okay, now we'll come to my second major part, the relationship between Christian commitment and science. Excuse me, I'm just reminding myself of where I'm going. Okay, so the main thing I want to begin with here is to encourage us all to really think and appreciate the depth and breadth of the goodness which has in fact come from scientific understanding of processes in the natural world. And I begin with an example from just general healthcare, because it's easy to make the example. So if you were to go back as little as 100 years, you would find that life was such that people had to worry about or think hard about very serious illnesses, life-threatening, such as polio, rubella, tuberculosis. So in most countries of the world, those diseases were a part of everyday life. It wasn't necessarily that one would suffer from them every day, but one might know someone who did, and they were very much around and had to be worried about. Whereas, of course, now in many countries, we hardly even think about a disease like polio. We know that sadly people do suffer from tuberculosis in parts of the world, but broadly speaking, in our country, they do not. And there are other big improvements. When as parents, if a woman goes to hospital to seek help for the process of childbirth, well, that's never an easy process, and it can have complications. But nevertheless, in a hospital now, in the modern world, in the countries where medicine is well developed, there's every reason to think that the woman's life will be cared for and preserved through whatever complications may arise. Whereas, of course, you don't have to go back that far in human history when the whole thing was much more fraught with risk. And again, continue to our experience as parents. Again, as parents, we 100 years ago, we would have had to just sort of acknowledge that child mortality was a fact of life, whereas for us now it isn't. So these are just examples of this tremendous change, which we perhaps don't always remember. It's good to think about it a little bit. And then I want to give you another example, which is illustrated by this person, Norman Ernest Borlaug. So he is the person who's associated with the development of an understanding of crops such as wheat and how they can be developed to have better properties of disease resistance and better productivity. And it was thanks to his work, which was, I have to say, long-term, careful, painstaking scientific work, first into the nature of the plants themselves, and then into the nature of how food production can be organized. So he then went on to advise countries like India and Pakistan how to feed their growing populations. And had it not been for what we now refer to as the Green Revolution, those countries basically would not have been able to feed their populations. So Norman Borlaug is sometimes said to have saved 1 billion lives, obviously with the help of those that also joined in with the organization. But the insight that he brought to bear was a tremendous good. And I think what we need to do is be able to see these currents of goodness in the world and acknowledge them as sort of science, humanity, and God in partnership. When James wrote in his letter about the notion that every good and perfect gift comes from heaven or from the Father of light, as he put it, he's giving an idea that streams of goodness in the world are to be faithfully recognized as both having they may well have a human element, but they also have an element in which the Holy Spirit has been at work. So when we talk about the Holy Spirit's work, it's important, I believe, that we should not simply fail to include some of these really big transformative things that have happened in the course of any given period of time. So therefore the Christian sort of a reaction to science or relationship with science, first of all, I think should be a very positive one, very celebratory, willing to engage. I realized that, of course, so I'll read that statement in a moment. I realized that, of course, scientific knowledge also leads to the ability to put that knowledge to work in negative ways. Of course, I also acknowledge that there are now, indeed, in the area of farming and agriculture, there are unsustainable practices which have come about, which we now need to reverse. And of course, science has also been put to work in developing weapons of mass destruction. So we should acknowledge also this negative part of the picture. But nevertheless, I want to insist on this statement that the understanding itself is a good thing. So a growing and shared understanding of the nature of the physical world is in itself a good thing. It is at the same time a part of our birthright as children of God. And it also becomes a wide and deep communal act of worship when we approach it the right way. So here then is a view of the sort of Christian engagement with science, which says that first and foremost, it's a positive, wise and celebratory engagement. But I also want to then move to the fact, I'll come to that picture in a minute. I want now to sort of invite us to think about the fact that just now in contemporary culture, the Christian community, certainly in the parts of the world that I'm aware of, and maybe more widely, that Christian community has got itself somewhat of a reputation of being a little bit nervous around science, a little bit not quite so enthusiastic about it as it might be. And I want to just sort of ask, is that so? And if so, why is it? And I'm going to also put it to you that there's an interesting related phenomenon going on, which I want to illustrate with this picture. Okay, so this is a picture of obviously toothpaste, and the notion is it's a sort of an example of a form of advertising. So you see in advertising sometimes this sort of approach where the product is displayed and recommended to us, and they might have some sort of slogan such as this one, with added fluoride. So of course fluoride is an interesting ingredient in toothpaste because it does indeed help to prevent tooth decay. So the advertiser is recommending the product by drawing attention to the positive component of the product. So with added fluoride is a perfectly sort of appropriate slogan. But of course, what an advertisement of this kind is sort of quietly failing to mention is that almost all brands of toothpaste, in fact, also have added fluoride. Okay, so this particular property doesn't really single out this brand from another. So they all have this. So this form of advertising is slightly, it's a very mild, but it's a very mild form of misdirection. Okay, now, what I think we see at the moment is that there's a worldview which we know is a very big part of our contemporary culture, and it goes by the name of secular humanism. And secular humanism also has a very positive sort of additional thing which it likes to say of itself, which is a bit like the slogan with added fluoride. I mean, that's not with added fluoride, it's with added science. Okay, so secular humanism celebrates and wants to present itself as the champion of science, or a way of life in which science is celebrated and engaged with and welcome and used, and its insights are at play and are seen for what they truly are. So they have this slogan. So the thing is, just at the moment then, the Christian community is not seen as sharing in this property of, having with added science. But the fact is, actually, we do have added science. Historically, the Christian contribution to science has been very positive. I've chosen not to go into that history today in my talk, but I just want to acknowledge it, that it's there. But what's happened is, of course, our communities have become somewhat nervous around some elements of science because it's seen as somehow bound up with secular humanism or with another worldview. And so that makes people nervous. But the answer to that is not to be nervous of science. The answer is that we need to become those who see science the most clearly. So that's partly why I wanted to begin this talk with my thoughts on the structure of scientific knowledge. So if we can be those that see science correctly, and therefore we can both be experts in it and also present it truthfully to the community at large, then that's probably the way forward, I think, to overcome this issue about the way we are seen. Let me think about where I'm heading now. I'm going to now say a bit more about how a Christian outlook or way of life might then sort of see science I've talked mostly now about the positive role of science, the positive benefits of it, and why we might want to celebrate the knowledge that it brings. I briefly acknowledged the fact that knowledge can be put to with bad uses. But I do then also want to add that the scientific knowledge is not the whole of what constitutes knowledge. Okay, so of course, I've alluded to this already in my diagram about the structure of science. That diagram did not show only science. But I want to sort of unpack that now a little bit more fully. So now I'm moving on to the limits of science, which are interesting. That it's not necessarily a limit of an area that science can investigate. It's a limit in the types of discourse and the types of truth and insight which science can grapple with. Okay, so let me give an example of that. The example comes from a question that came up in an event I was asked to join in with at Birmingham University, when one of the questions that we were put was the question, is Christianity compatible with evolution? So my reaction to that was to do my best to sort of turn the question on its head a little. I'm not going to quote from what I said on that occasion. I won't quote it word for word. The quote is also in our book. It keeps me seeking. But roughly speaking, I said, okay, the question is Christianity compatible with evolution? Well, it's sort of a crazy question. It's like asking, is learning to play the violin compatible with the fact that trees grow from seeds? I mean, of course they're compatible. How could they not be? Because, of course, what it is to have Christian commitment is first and foremost to have some sense of loyalty to, well, Jesus himself and what he said and represents, and a willingness to learn further from him, and a willingness to see life as very much about free forgiveness rather than a sort of earned reaction from God. It's very much about living from a motivation of gratitude and compassion and things like this. You know, these are the sort of the heart of it, or the deeper things. And then after that, from that perspective, one begins to look around at the wider world and see what it is, what's going on in the world. But it doesn't follow from that one learns the evidence about the development of life on Earth, which has been discovered over a long period now. It doesn't mean one begins to feel the need to dismiss all that evidence or sort of doubt it. Rather, one has the wish to sort of think about it more fully and understand what that long, interesting story of life on Earth has really shown us. So as I say, the question about, you know, is a Christian commitment compatible with evolutionary biology? My first reaction has to be, you know, in summary, the answer is this. Well, of course, Christianity is compatible with what happened. Christianity is a recognition of the nature of what happened. And by what happened here, I include, of course, the events around the life of Christ as the heart of it. But, you know, coming from there as a starting point and looking more generally, it also includes a recognition of the nature of what happened over the eons of development of the natural world. So the cosmos is probably about 14 billion years old, and Earth is this wonderful place in which rich forms of life have developed over 4 billion years. And of course, we now have a very large amount of insight into the nature of that process. And all that scientific insight tells us correctly about the development of the way in which inheritance works with the handing on of genetic material. It tells us correctly about the fact that many organisms produce many more eggs or offspring than will in fact survive. So there is a sort of filtering that goes on from one generation to another. You know, all the frog spawn that was produced in all the ponds of England this year will produce many more tadpoles than there will eventually be frogs. I mean, this is just a small example. So these sort of are facts of evolutionary biology, which we just ponder and see what they imply. So then we build up this scientific picture of the nature of the development of the world. And ultimately, what the scientific picture is a description. It's a detailed description of what happened. So I want now to allude to the fact that detailed description, nevertheless, is not the whole story that we ought to be telling about the world. And in what sense is it not the whole story? So I want to put it to you that sometimes people want to say the phrase, science can explain a lot, but it cannot explain X. You know, where X is some particular thing which they have in mind. So the example might be, science can explain a lot, but it cannot explain the beginnings of life on Earth. Or it cannot explain the process whereby the flagellum motor in single-celled organisms, such as bacteria, came along. You know, so this is the claim. But I want to put it to you that that's the wrong way to put it, the wrong way to understand the limits of science. So the better statement is this. Rather than saying science explains a lot but not everything, it's often more apt or more precise to say science does not fully explain anything at all. Okay, so I think that's a better way of putting it. It's not that there's a little detailed bit where science, meaning I'm now referring, of course, to the general processes of the natural world. Just for the moment, I'm not talking about miracles. I'm talking about the broad brush of most of what goes on in the world. So it's a mistake to say science explains a lot but not everything. If by the not something, you put something where actually there's good reason to believe that it is part of the natural processes of the world. So the origin of life is a good example here, because that remains very much an unknown quantity at the moment. We don't know how life began on planet Earth. We don't know the sequence of things that happened. However, it's reasonable to hold, again, we don't know, but it's reasonable to take the view that that sequence was part of the ordinary patterns of nature, the patterns which are God-given patterns, which allow the world to be what it is. So we don't know for sure, but there's good reason to believe that that event was part of the natural pattern of things. And so I would be reluctant to say science cannot explain it at all. You know, it doesn't have anything to say, but rather I'd like to say what science does is tease it out. It tells us the nature of the sequence and the pattern of what's happening. But that is a very important thing to do and very fascinating and insightful. But it's not the whole of what constitutes explanation, because it's part of this bigger picture, the big picture which I began with, the network of ideas, and the fact that ultimately science is like a thread. It's like a thread of connections, and it's an intricate and detailed thread, such that one can be caught up with studying it, caught up with its details, and find much fulfillment in studying all of those processes. But it's a thread which comes to a stop at both ends. The ends I refer to now are the ends, on one hand, of what we can call either origins or depth. Origins and depth, I mean by those words, not only origins a long time ago, but also origins right now in the present moment. So the depth of where things are coming from in their existence. So science cannot account for the present existence, ultimately, of anything. That existence is mysterious to science. Science only comes in once the existence is taken for granted, and then it can describe it. So there's one end of our thread, which is sort of hanging in the void as far as scientific description is concerned. And the other end, of course, is the end of the larger meaning of the whole of what goes on. So science cannot itself tell us the purpose of events in the world. It's rather for us to respond and think and give our best and most honest view of what we think is going on ultimately. You know, what does it all amount to? What does it mean? Why? What is its purpose? And one view might be there is no purpose to the natural world, because I don't hold that view, but that's a view. But we must each bring our own view. My point here is merely that whatever view we bring about the nature of purpose in the world, that itself is not a scientific exercise. You know, science itself cannot determine for us, you know, by doing careful experiments and reasoning and maths and so on, we don't arrive at the conclusion about whether or not human beings ought to treat one another as equals. You know, so yeah. So my point then is that the limits of science are both ends, both depth and the other end, purpose. So science is on its own is like this thread hanging in the void. You know, it needs these other things, these other aspects to our wisdom and our human life to sort of, and only then does it find its place and sit properly and happily and well with everything that we are trying to do as we live. Okay, so there we are. By that, I hope that I've underlined reasons for positive acknowledgement of science, because of course when we see its limits, we're not being negative about science, we're just seeing it truthfully, and that enables us to be positive about it, because we see it for what it is and we can enjoy it for what it is. Okay, so I'm keeping an eye on my watch now, because I know that I ought not to go speak for much longer, and I do aim now to finish in the next sort of 5 minutes. I hope that won't be too long. But I did promise you I'd say some briefer words about a few areas. So let me go to those briefer words. Now, I noticed that I have a little conclusion of part 2. I think it would be a moment to pause and read through that conclusion. So here are some points that I hope you've picked up. First, it is good to get the kind of insight into the physical world that scientific investigation furnishes. Point 1. Then next, this insight is not in itself the overall signature or theme all meaning of what goes on in the world. And then my third point here, I alluded to earlier when I said that the world appears not to be a place that simply develops in a completely automatic way. So a view of the nature of the world might be that it's really a great big machine and we're cogs in that machine. But I think that's an incorrect view. So I think a more apt metaphor or a statement of the nature of the world will be to call it a meeting place. So a place where we meet with each other, with other organisms and creatures, and of course, ultimately, we meet with God. Okay, so now some brief comments on a few areas. So here I just picked some areas where I detected just sort of currents of discussion, of perhaps slight feelings of people a bit uneasy with certain areas and wanting to just have brief comments on them. So I'll say a bit about these. So faith and uncertainty, then miracles, cosmology, and evolutionary biology. As I say, I'm going to go a little bit quicker than perhaps I originally planned, but it means that I'm inviting, should people want these to be unpacked a little further, please prompt me and we can do that in a moment. But first, the first point on faith and uncertainty, I think here all I want to do here is put it to us all that uncertainty, which is such a valuable part of science. You see, uncertainty plays a big role in science. Science is very much to do with getting a clear view of the things that we've established very well and the things where we don't yet know what's going on. And also, whenever we measure something, we measure not only we don't just have a number, we also have some idea of how precise is that number, what range of precision have we achieved. So uncertainty plays a very positive role in science. And I think I want to say that uncertainty, understood in the right way, is simply part of knowledge. It's a part of wisdom. There is no such thing as certain knowledge, apart perhaps from a few sort of mathematical derivations and a few examples of a very sort of direct logic. Things there maybe can be certain, but broadly speaking, our lives are not based on certainty. And so I think in the context of Christian commitment, we just need to perhaps be a bit more willing to acknowledge this and not be worried by it and troubled by it. Sometimes I think we imply to one another that we ought to think, that the correct or the faithful position is to be a little bit more certain than in fact any of us are. But if we take that idea, if we sort of pressure ourselves individually or else one another to live as if we were more certain than we are, it's actually a mistake. It's also somewhat of a psychologically dangerous thing to do. It's not a healthy practice to encourage people to think of themselves as other than is true about them. So let's just be willing to acknowledge our uncertainty. So I want to just give the example of, for me, of the fact that I honestly think it is the case that Christ was raised, for example. I think that is the case that Christ was raised, he was met with, after his death by his followers. And they then passed on that knowledge to others. And I'm willing to live as far as I can. I don't achieve this very well, but I'm trying to live as though in the light of this. But I don't think I want to say I'm certain of it. I'm willing to just keep going. That's me. I'm enjoying the freedom to say that. And I hope maybe others might feel it's a healthy freedom to say that we're not absolutely certain. Okay, coming on now to miracles. Miracles, I just want to briefly acknowledge that coming from a scientific perspective, science as discipline is unable to pronounce in the end the sort of verdict, oh, there is no such thing that can possibly happen as a miracle. Science in the end can only say what we already know, which is that miracles are very, very rare. So if there is such a thing as a process that is other than the ordinary sequences of nature, different from the ordinary patterns of the world, what we know is that such things are very, very rare. And science can't really say anything more than that. So it's extremely rare that water could, large quantities of water could turn to wine, or that a person born without the ability to see is suddenly able to see. So these things are indeed such that we cannot say categorically that could never be. We don't have the right or the knowledge to assert that. We can say that could be. However, let's not overstate the role of miracles. So most of us have heard of very valuable health outcomes for individuals who faced really difficult situations, and their health has improved rapidly in a way that a doctor is unable to say how that could have happened. And so these are events, of course, we celebrate, and we're right to thank God for them. But at the same time, let's not forget that for everyone who has a really lovely outcome, there's 100 other people who faced a very similar health difficulty, which maybe led to a life-restricting result, and they have to live with that outcome. They have to struggle with it, or they may even lose. They may lose a loved one. So let's just be very careful when we talk about miracles that we don't inadvertently also give another message, which was not intended, but the message that somehow these other people who are struggling are somehow less cared about by God or by ourselves, or as if we don't want to see their struggle. We'd rather focus on the positive outcome. So I guess I'm just reminding us of what it takes to live really compassionately and wisely in the world, and it's to see everyone and to acknowledge the struggles of those for whom the outcome was not so great, and ask, what's our role there? Okay, we can talk further about miracles, but I wanted to say those things. Briefly on cosmological origins, here I just want to acknowledge that the origins of the universe as a whole are indeed mysterious to us. Physics can say a lot about the early processes of the Big Bang, about the dense, hot early stage of the universe, but science in itself cannot say much about how there can be the universe in the first place. But we also need to be careful not to overstate this. So the remarkable fact that the universe is as it is and can support life seems to be very deeply woven into the world. It seems that if the world, the fundamental principles of nature were ever so slightly different, it appears that would have a very big impact and the universe would change greatly such that it might not support life. So this is the notion called fine-tuning. And people have tried to argue that in view of this fact that the universe is so very precisely tuned, as it were, such that it can support life, the argument goes, so how can that be? Surely it must be that tuning was brought about by a willed action, a willed act. And of course, the one who acted and willed is God. Now, we just need to be very careful about this argument, because although, as a matter of fact, I think that it is God that created the world and willed it to be as it is, it's not in fact a logical sequence to say, given that the world is fine-tuned, the most natural explanation is that came about by a willed choice. That sequence of ideas is not a logical sequence. So we are not helping either ourselves or anyone else if we argue as if it were logical, because if in fact it is not, but we say it is, all we succeed in doing is demonstrating to other people our lack of intellectual rigor. And of course, that doesn't do either them or us any good at all. It risks bringing the whole gospel into disrepute if we are not careful in how we present our reasoning. Okay, I just wanted to say that. And then on evolutionary biology, here I've alluded to it already, and I wanted here just to remind you of some of the ways of looking at it that we might want to think about. So I guess the one I want to talk about here is randomness and openness. So there is it would appear, processes happen in the natural world for no particular reason that we can identify. So they're sometimes called random. More than one thing might happen. But that's another word for that same idea is the word open. More than one outcome might happen in a given case. So I want to say that openness is maybe not such a terrible thing. It has both negative and positive sides. Negatively, it can lead to disease and really serious disease like cancer. Uh, Positively, it can open up avenues for richer forms of life to come about. And of course, what in fact happened in the natural world was richer forms of life came about. And it came about by interesting methods. A lot of improvisation is going on. There's a lot of signs of really remarkably making wonderful new, richer and deeper possibilities come about by bringing together humble and mundane materials. That's a theme of evolution. It's a rather beautiful theme, I think. And also there's a theme of richer ways of being in community that come about as things went on. To move from invertebrates, eventually through to birds, mammals, and apes and humans. Richer and richer ways of being in community are able to find physical expression. So there are some very lovely patterns going on, and these patterns are not random. So that sequence of this ever richer realization is not a random outcome. It was pretty much guaranteed that something like that would happen. The big picture is that something like that would happen. Okay, now I will now stop. I have now spoken a little bit longer than I originally planned. I hope you will feel I haven't gone on too long, but there we are. Here's a reminder of that overall picture about the structure of science, and I want to finish on that note and just put it to you that this picture might become a thing that anyone with a more artistic bent or an artistic skill, I invite maybe to think about this way of celebrating science and its role in our lives, and it could become maybe captured in an artwork. I'd love someone to have a go, and then the artwork could become a little talking point, maybe in a place of worship or as an educational aid or something like that. So thanks again. As I say, I'll stop there and let's see if we can have some interesting further discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That's great. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. Please do type some questions in the chat section of YouTube. We've got 3 that's come in, so we'll begin with those. But keep them coming. We're going to go until just before 11:15, and when we're going to take a break. So let's have some questions. Now, you may need to unpack this question for us, Andrew. The first question asks, are you in agreement with Kaufman's theory of emergence? So you'll need to explain what that means for the non-science folk.
I think I know where. I think I know where that question's coming from.
Okay.
So the term emergence is a reasonably well-established term in areas of science. I think Kaufman is among those who've particularly championed the notion of its significance, but he's not at all the only person to have thought and written about this idea. So emergence is broadly the notion that when many parts come together to make a whole, it often happens that the nature of the whole is such that it can display types of behavior, types of existence, which are qualitatively new and different. So this is just if I return to my illustration using bridge and stone, so it's they're illustrated in a very simple but quick way. The notion of the bridge is a structure which has strength under compression and makes a connection from one place to another. So that's this sort of emergent property, which can be said of a bridge, but you can't say that particular property of any of the individual stones. So that's just a very simple example. But of course, emergence is much more richly seen in biological examples. Communities of ants, the ant colony as a whole has various aspects and properties which cannot be asserted of the individual ants. Okay, so up to this point then, I'm saying, I'm happy with the concept of emergence. I think it plays an important, helpful role for us. But I also would say it's sometimes slightly overstated. It's overstated when it's used to imply that somehow the emerging behavior sometimes people imply that emergent behaviour is somehow just an afterthought, or it's as if to say what's really happening is all the little ants running around. And it's sort of, oh, therefore, this afterthought came along and the overall colony had the behaviour it did. So that is, I think, when the concept is pushed too far. And to say a little more about what I mean there, I'm going to jump now a little bit all the way to human culture. Of course, a whole lot more levels of richness there. But when we say of various things, you know, they are good or bad, or when we look at values and we assert, for example, that trust is an attitude of trust towards one another as we meet with one another is the right starting point, rather than an attitude of suspicion. Or we believe that a combination of forgiveness, justice mixed with forgiveness, is the right combination to face disputes rather than revenge. You know, so what we're doing there, we are asserting truths which are profoundly so, and I hold that they are so, and they would still be true, even if the physical world were very different. So these truths, at one level, emerge from our biological nature, you know, from our cell biology. You could say they're emergent. But they would still be true, even if our cell biology was completely different. So these truths about human value, human nature, and the way we ought to live, have their own validity in and of themselves. So I want to say that. So you see, I'm both positive about emergence, but also want to say, but nevertheless, it doesn't quite capture the whole of what we need to say about things that go on in the world. I hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Andrew. Do you mind if I just follow up on that slightly? Because certainly in theology and theological anthropology, there's a conversation around emergence theory in relation to the human constitution. So historically, the tripartite or dualistic notions of body, soul, spirit, or you know, however those configures, and there's a huge debate around the best way to talk about that. But the way in which emergence theory has tended to be used in that conversation more recently, associated with a guy called Philip Clayton, I think it is, Amos Young, the idea that the spiritual emerges out of the material and is not constituted alongside it in terms of the human constitution. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to begin by saying that I find myself that the way of thinking about human nature, which has come to be called dualism or dualist, personally from it now, I find that doesn't really quite work for me. And I think what Mark's just alluded to is that that's true now for most of us. You know, many of us now are feeling like the notion of dualism, where one is able to talk about using the word soul, for example, as you know, a little bit more distinct from body than perhaps is quite right. I think what I've certainly sort of grown up with in the Christian context is the notion that the Bible doesn't quite see it that way either. It doesn't speak in this dualistic way, and of course ultimately I guess we take. Well, I was going to say we take the incarnation as a very important sort of clue here. I'm not sure if that's the right word, because of course ultimately we are invited to see ourselves as children of God and servants of God, but nevertheless, that's distinct from the theological notion of Jesus' sonship. You know, his sonship is of different caliber and quality. But I think when we're talking in this area, the notion of that we are one body. So the word soul for me is a way of speaking about what is really so about the person, the human being. So to say that a human being has a soul is not to say that there's sort of two things. It's a bit like saying a human being has personhood. Or if we look at a more simple example, just take an ordinary brick from which we might use to build a house. Well, a brick has brickness. The soul of a brick is its bricky nature. So a human being has a soul, which is a way of talking about what it is that is essential to who they are in their humanity as a person. And that humanity is expressed in their physical nature. And of course, a crucial aspect for me here, and I'm sure many will resonate with this, is that we are taught to understand that the resurrection itself is a physical thing, and that our own resurrection, which remains obviously very much a wonder and a mystery to us, but is part of, we think, a glorious global future for the cosmos as a whole, a sort of blossoming of the whole of the natural order into something wonderful, and yet somehow embodied. So, we don't claim to be able to know how to describe this very fully, but this notion that, so the idea is, the question, or the starting point of this, so is the word emergence going to help with seeing it this way? And I guess the answer for me is it can help if we choose that it does. If we agree that when we talk about a person, we want to affirm the precious value of them very much right down to their physical being. And then we want to unpack exactly how it is that who they really are comes about. We can use words like emergence if we want. And I think one could use the concept and lead to a sort of a mistaken view, but with more care, one arrives at helpful insight. But I think the overall idea is right, that a person should be seen as one, it's not that our bodies die and then our soul carries on. I think it's slightly better to say our whole person is in God's keeping at every moment. And in that keeping, it has a future. Okay. I'm beginning to run out of things that I feel like I want to say.
That's fine, Andrew. Thank you for that. I mean, this is a huge debate in certain aspects of theology. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. So another question was about the Birmingham questionnaire, and had that person been more specific and asked, is the acceptance of the description of the process of evolution compatible with Genesis' description of processes? How would you reply? I guess.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, over to you. Yeah.
Fine. Okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you had an
That's fine.
comment. I think the starting point there with Genesis, I feel, is let's first turn to our best effort as a community, and also let's look to those who have expertise in the area of literary genre. Let's start there. So let's ask ourselves, what is the nature of the literary aims and process that's at work in the opening books of the Bible? What role were they intended to play, both in their original setting and then for us now? So that's the first question. And once we've got to grips with that, then we can see how they interact with other sort of areas of knowledge that we have. So on literary genre there, I would say that it seems reasonably straightforward, to me at least, to say that the genre of both the first few chapters of Genesis are in that area intermediate between factual statements about the nature of the physical world. They're not wholly at that end. They're intermediate between there and another form of writing, which is more figurative and conveying truth through the means of carefully constructed sort of bringing together of ideas, the sort of thing which a poet does. But nor is it, I think, quite correct to say, oh, it's just a poet. It's just a poem, because it is making a really careful effort to look at the nature of the physical world, the one we're really in, and ask questions or give insight into what it's like and what we might learn from it. Now, I understand that the first chapter of Genesis has some interesting sort of resonances with other writings from the Middle East, roughly in the same period. And you can deduce from this that the Hebrew community wrote that partly to help their own community respond to and give a better view of origins than the ones that they were hearing or that other communities around were giving. So other communities were talking about warring divine beings and humans as sort of slaves that came about by at the end of some argument. I'm being a little bit hasty there, but what Genesis is doing is first saying, no, you can forget all those warring gods and all that stuff. Just come back to the notion of a single-willed act on the part of one great creator. And of course, the sequence in the first chapter involves the notion of inanimate stuff comes first in the sequence. Light and dark, solid and fluid, and the lights that play a role. And of course, there's the sequence is very much looking at the role that things play in the natural world. So for me then, as I said, the first point is the literary genre. So it's not problematic for me, and I hope it will not be problematic for others as we talk to one another, to just receive the opening chapter for what it is as using language figuratively in order to convey actually very helpful insights into the nature of the creative process. Because I won't now say much more about the Garden of Eden, although the question might want to say, oh yes, let's hear a bit more about that. But I think the Garden of Eden, again, there are elements there which to me signal to me that there are very much figurative uses of language are going on. And the most clear element to me there would be the use of the two trees. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, those are symbols. To me, that's how they are naturally to be read. That's what I think the original writer had in mind that I would receive from from that account. That we're talking symbolically about the nature of human life, about the relationship between the creature and the creator, and things of that kind. Okay, so I'll leave it there for now, but do come back if more is going to be helpful.
Thanks, Andrew, for that. Here's a question to do, I think, to do with culture, really, non-Western culture and non-Western views of science within their own cultural worldviews. So let me read it. Right now, science is disproportionately helping some parts of the total human population more than others. For example, around vaccines for COVID. This could be due to economics. In another sense, it may be because in some parts of the world there is a worldview that is not scientific. So the causation, presumably, of COVID is viewed as more social. Should science wait for other cultures and contexts to catch up, or rush ahead in putting in place certain kinds of activity in order that some populations might not have the risk of becoming extinct?
Yeah.
Do you get the sense of the question, Andrew?
Yeah, I think I have a sense of it. I've seen this myself already in the context of AIDS, which is an equally, or in some respects, even more sort of worrying or powerful example of a similar thing, whereby communities have put themselves at much greater risk than they might have done, partly because they were simply either unwilling or unable to really grasp that the knowledge that was being offered to them about the causes of that disease, AIDS, and one could say now something similar about COVID-19. Others, coming from the more scientific perspective, were trying to offer insight into what was causing the problem and how it can be, what behaviours can help. And that message, given in all goodwill, was for some communities sort of outside their concept of they just couldn't quite grasp it. And what can happen there is tragic. My answer to the question, so what then is the appropriate behaviour? I think the appropriate behaviour here is for those that have the opportunity to try to make that step into the other culture, such that they become trusted within that culture. So people have got to cross over these cultural boundaries and not come in too with the appearance of too much aggression, or it's not quite aggression. That's too strong a word. With the appearance of being a little bit perhaps unwilling to see why the other culture is as it is. We've got to somehow learn to be with people in the place they're at, even when some of their cultural assumptions are really unhelpful. We've got at least to sort of show that we are those that have similar concerns and worries, and we're with them in life's journey. And then, of course, we then bring all the helpful insight which we possibly can. And of course, in the case of AIDS, slowly this has been going on, and I hope clearly with COVID it will go on too. But it's a question of doing our best to do what helps, and what helps includes the scientific knowledge, but it also includes wisdom about how, in fact, human communities are made to be a bit more open to new ways of looking at things. And how does it happen? It often happens through humble stepping into and joining in with a community, rather than appearing like sort of outsiders, sort of critiquing from the margins. Yeah, so this is, I guess, this is an example where many of those that are last shall be first. Many of those across the world who are doing this humble work, unknown to the headlines, are, I guess, treasured by God. And they will be first. Anyway, thanks for the question.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'm probably going to take a break slightly earlier. We do have one more question that we might come back to in the plenary, and it's about congregations and science, which I think is really important, and how congregations, so perhaps we can take that tomorrow in the plenary, about the role of congregations. And the question is about congregations being complacent with the negative aspects of science, or the perceived negative aspects of science, so that in a sense accepting those aspects and not engaging more positively in the conversation. So something around congregations and science and their acceptance of some of the negative stuff, rather than simply engaging. So hold that in your on your list of questions for tomorrow, if that's all right.
Great. Yeah, that'd be very good. To say more about that.
When I was living in the States for some time, and one of my closest friends in my church congregation was actually professor of mathematics at a local university and was a physicist, and he had a hugely important role in helping the church engage with science, and would occasionally give talks about cloud formation. Actually, he loved cloud formation, was one of his, and he had wonderful pictures. But it was a way of helping the congregation understand the positive aspects of scientific description and explanation. So anyway, that's just an aside from me. Thanks so much, Andrew, and we really appreciate your input today. We give you a huge round of applause. So if you probably can't do that if you're watching on YouTube, but we're very grateful. Thank you, Andrew. We're going to take a short break till 11 when Professor Richard Bell will be coming to give a paper. And while we're having a break, there will be a short video which will tell you something about our research degrees. We have 3 research degrees, Master of Theology, Master of Philosophy, and PhD. And so we're going to run a short video now which tells you a little bit about our research degrees, and then we'll come back at 11 o'clock for the next paper. So thanks very much, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
My name's Adrian, and I'm a student on the MAITH program here at London School of Theology. LST is located in a leafy suburb of one of the most historic capital cities of the world, known for its rich cultural heritage as well as its libraries. LST was formed during the Second World War by a group of influential evangelicals, and since then, it's been leading worldwide on theological studies and research. The essential aspect of the British PhD is the relationship between the supervisor and the student.
I'm Chloe Lynch and I'm lecturer in practical theology here. For me, supervision is about engaging a student's ideas. It's about bringing a critical edge, helping them to question their ideas, to chase down the sources, to do the things that they think are too hard to do with the questions they want to ask. But it's not just about the critical piece. My job also is to be attentive, to be noticing what are the things that are emerging in your research? What are the things that you haven't yet named, that you don't yet have language for? And my job is to help you notice those. And because it's Christian research, to notice too where the Spirit might be inviting you to go next in your research. Being supervised here at LST for me was, at that time, the biggest discipleship journey I'd ever been on. My supervisor understood what a journey of faith it was for me. And so I grew a huge amount spiritually, but I also had some really practical outcomes. I was supervised in such a way that what I ended up writing was publishable and was published, in fact, a few years ago in the Routledge Practical Theology series under the title Ecclesial Leadership as Friendship. In addition to the publication, what being supervised here also did for me was that it set me up for a ministry I never expected. I was a church leader. I was writing because I wanted to make sense of what it meant to be a church leader and how to think about that theologically. But in the end, I found myself not only working as a church leader, but also joining the faculty here at LST.
As a graduate, your opportunities to serve Christ in the academy, the church, and the community will be greatly enhanced.
My name is Dastahe Liso. I am an Ethiopian. I studied at the London School of Theology. I did my doctorate here, and then I went back to Ethiopia, served for more than a decade. I'm now back in the UK with my family, and I'm a visiting lecturer here at the London School of Theology. Doing doctoral studies is an exciting but challenging process. It can be a very lonely process, but one can also learn tenacity and perseverance through that. And I benefited from doing doctoral studies here because it taught me how to persevere and how to be patient and how to be determined to get there. Another benefit of doing doctoral studies here at LSD, I would say this is the main benefit, that is getting a license to teaching. PhD is a license to teaching. Some people might talk about status, about credibility, about economic benefits, but in my view, PhD is a license to teaching. So I got a license to teach at the Ethiopian Graduate School of Theology and elsewhere in Ethiopia, and I'm teaching here at the London School of Theology because I have that license. So the main benefit of doing doctoral studies is getting a license to teach. The final benefit of doing doctoral studies here at LST is that it has enabled me to become part of the global academic community. So I'm an Ethiopian, I'm from Africa, but I'm able to converse with other scholars across the world because I'm a member of the British New Testament Society and Society of Biblical Literature. If I hadn't done doctoral studies here, I wouldn't have been able to become a member of the global community.
Thanks so much for watching. If you want to get in touch for more information or simply to apply, we would love to hear from you.
Richard has studied theoretical physics at the University College London and also theology at the Universities of Oxford and Tübingen, and he's Professor of Theology at the University of Nottingham. He's the author of a number of books, 4 on the New Testament theology, discussing subjects such as jealousy, seeking God, the irrevocable call of God, and evil. He's also published a number of books on Richard Wagner, published by Whippenstock, and he is a keen researcher of Wagner. And he's also been influenced by a number of key thinkers, including Martin Luther, Immanuel Kant, and Hegel. And we'll be hearing more about Hegel today. He's also someone who admires the composer Johann Sebastian Bach. The title of his paper is "But When the Fullness of Time Has Come, God Sent His Son," G.W.F. Hegel on time. And there are notes that you can refer to that were circulated prior to the conference today. So please do follow along those notes. They've been made available to you. So without further ado, let me pass you over to Richard. Thank you so much for being with us today, Richard.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be speaking to you today. So let's launch into this. In an earlier study, this is called Deliver Us from Evil, published in 2007, I developed a philosophical framework based on Kant and Schopenhauer in an attempt to make sense of the exorcisms of Jesus. Jesus' combat with the world of demons was related to a 2-tier approach to reality. First, as phenomena, whereby objects of experience are subject to conditions of cognition, such as those of space and time. And secondly, and more fundamentally, as things in themselves, where space and time do not apply. One spin-off of this approach was that it allowed room for the idea of the human soul, such a soul being an aspect of the human person that transcends space and time. I related this soul to what Kant called the thing in itself, and considered the human body to be a manifestation of this soul in space-time. So one way of putting this is that if you want the best picture of my soul, look at my body. And the only being who can fully comprehend the soul, who can look at the human person from no particular spatial perspective, in a timeless way, and without using any categories or language, is God himself. But this, of course, is the God of classical theism. Now, in this study, Deliver Us from Evil, I illustrated the metaphysics of the human person in terms of a cone of personhood. So I made a distinction between the subject, which is on the boundary of the world, and I represented this by the tip of that cone, and the soul in the depths of the world, represented by the base. Although I think something had thereby been achieved, the understanding of time of Kant and Schopenhauer and the way I applied it raises 3 possible problems. The first problem is the subjective nature of time. I will return to this, but briefly for Kant, time is an a priori intuition. So, a priori means independence of experience, and intuition is immediate, non-conceptual knowledge of something. Schopenhauer has a similar view. Time, together with space and causality, quote, reside a priori in our consciousness. So this subjective understanding of time is a possible problem. The second possible problem is that in this Kantian Schopenhauerian scheme, time was portrayed as abstract and insufficiently theological. My theological anthropological statements about the metaphysics of the human person were made independent of the reality of God, although sometimes I brought in ideas from scripture to elucidate my conception of the person. Thirdly, the view of the self which emerged in my study was highly individualistic and failed to do justice to the idea of community. So a community, according to my scheme, consisted of a multiplicity of isolated cones of personhood. To correct these problems, I turn in this paper to Hegel's understanding of time. Although this could cause problems in relation to questions of the soul and personal immortality, now Hegel essentially abolished any idea of thing in itself, his treatment of time is much more conducive to some fundamental aspects of Christian theology, such as the Trinitarian understanding of God and the church living in the power of the Spirit. One of the great strengths of Hegel's approach is that he takes history seriously. And within this, the incarnation, the life and death of Jesus Christ, and the bestowal of the Spirit on the newly formed Christian community are central. Thereby, I think Hegel manages to say something about what time actually is, and may thereby offer some assistance to Augustine when he writes of time. If nobody asked me, I know, but if I were desirous to explain it to one that would ask me, I know not. Hegel rightly stresses the nature of flux, so compare Heraclitus. And indeed, his key idea of spirit can be understood as flux. So spirit is not a thing, but rather an activity. It is like mind, and in fact, his term Geist is translated not only as spirit, but also often as mind. Spirit is central, not only to Hegel's whole philosophy, but, as we shall see, it is a key to his understanding of time. Hegel, however, has come in for serious criticism by theologians. And as we proceed, I think some of the possible problems with his approach will become clear. But whatever criticisms are leveled against him, I think he is to be credited with his thoroughly theological approach to the nature of time and the nature of the human person. One way he achieves this is by making no simple separation between God and the world. Without the world, God is not God, he claimed. Further, he understands that the human being is not simply to be considered as finite, but in a certain sense as infinite. And following through his ideas, one can say that the incarnation is not a piece of metaphysical nonsense, but in a sense is perfectly rational. And so I come now to the second part of my talk, time in the phenomenology. One of the works where Hegel establishes the centrality of the incarnation, together with other central Christian ideas, is in his Phenomenology of Spirits of 1807, and it is certainly one of the greatest works ever of philosophy. It is through this work that I will carry out my study of Hegel's understanding of time. The phenomenology is by no means an easy work, and if you're new to it, I set out on the handout the basic structure. And just to add that many German works have a dual structure, as does the phenomenology. So we have, as you can see, those three parts, which I've set out in bold, but then you have a series of chapters 1 through to 8. So I'll start with the preface to the phenomenology. Hegel argues that the mathematical view of time and space, which one can add is so fundamental to the physics of Galileo, Descartes, and Newton, and which underpins the philosophy of Kant and Schopenhauer, has severe limitations, since it fails to grasp that time is the existent concept itself, and fails to grasp the spiritual, historical time of spirit. So one can say that mathematical time does not tell you what time actually is. So consider, for example, this equation for the wavefront produced by a light flash originating at a point of origin O and radiating in all directions. At time t, the wavefront forms a sphere having a radius of ct. C is the speed of light, t is time. And we can write this equation: x squared plus y squared plus z squared equals c squared t squared. So x, y, z, the three coordinates of three-dimensional space. But this does not tell you anything about the nature of time itself. It simply tells you how time can be related to space quantitatively, the key constant being the speed of light, c. If it does say anything about time, it is telling you that it's rather like space. And this very idea of the spatialization of time could be misleading. Immanuel Kant tried to fill out this mathematical view of time by saying it is an inner sense, whereas space is outer sense. But one has to ask again whether this really says much. And it's worth quoting his words towards the beginning of what's called the transcendental aesthetic of his critique of pure reason, since it introduces some important terms and ideas which Hegel and other German idealists were to adopt. So here goes. By means of outer sense, a property of our mind, we represent, the verb for represent is vorstellen, we represent to ourselves objects as outsiders, and all without exception in space. In a sense, by means of which the mind, that's Gemüt, intuits itself or its inner state, yields indeed no intuition of the soul, that's the Seele, itself as an object. But there is nevertheless a determinate form, namely time, in which alone the intuition, Anschauen, of inner states is possible, and everything which belongs to inner determination is therefore represented, vorgestellt, in relations of time. Now, I appreciate that's not very easy, but I think Kant has here introduced some essential terms which we need to understand. Now, one of the great strengths of Hegel's phenomenology is that he may tell us what time actually is. And the way he does this is not by an abstract discussion of ontology, the science of being, although as he proceeds with his argument, he slowly approaches it and finally says fundamental things about God, the world, and the human person. Rather, he is doing phenomenology. So a logic of appearing of spirits. So phenomenon, that comes from the Greek verb phino, I appear, and logos. So phenomenology of spirits is the logic of appearing of spirits. And when he discusses the logic of the appearances of spirit, he's discussing the spirit immanently. And this is clear in the very first discussion of time in chapter 1, which concerns sense certainty. That's in the German sinnliche Gewissheit, and time is here fundamental. So Hegel, this chapter, by saying that sense certainty appears to be the truest knowledge, for it has not as yet omitted anything from the object. The word for object there is Gegenstand, but has the object before it in its perfect entirety. So the assumption is that, as Stern understands it, because it does not use concepts, sense certainty is in a position to grasp a thing as an individual without any abstraction. And that in so doing, sense certainty gives us the most important kind of knowledge, which is of things as concrete, singular entities. Now, Hegel writes that in sense certainty, and I'm sorry, on the handout there is a couple of mistakes. I put self-certainty, it's sense certainty. Okay, Hegel writes that in sense certainty, quote, pure being at once splits into what we have called two thises. There is one this as I, and the other this as object. One of the key things Hegel attempts to clarify is that in sense certainty, neither I nor object is immediately present, but rather each is at the same time mediated. So I have this certainty through something else, the thing, and it similarly is in self-certainty through something else, namely the I. In the next paragraph, Hegel asks whether in sense certainty itself, the object is in fact the kind of essence that sense certainty proclaims it to be. The essence of Hegel's argument is that what sense certainty grasps in experience is not unique to the individual object. Issues of time and place now enter the discussion. So, sense certainty itself must be asked, what is the this? In the twofold shape of its being, one can say it is present as here and now. But Hegel argues that existing here and now is far from unique to the object, and so fails to acquire knowledge unique to the object. Now, in sections 95 to 97, he considers now in an argument which may appear to be somewhat perverse. So to the question, what is now? We may answer, now is night. And if we want, we can write this down. But then later, if now is noon, that earlier truth becomes what he says stale, zu schal in German. We therefore have the problem that the object of sense certainty proves to be the universal, not the particular and unique. It could be, of course, that Hegel is simply playing with words, and this is an accusation leveled against him by Feuerbach. So in sense certainty, one moment in time leads to another, and the now does indeed preserve itself. The problem we are left with is that sense experience has thus itself demonstrated that its real content is not the particular, but the universal. So that's chapter 1. Since chapter 2 does not concern time as such, I will pass over it, and I will turn to the next chapter, which concerns force and understanding, bearing the subtitle Appearance and the Supersensible World. Here, we're in the world of mathematical time we found in the preface. And it should be noted that the word Verstand, usually translated understanding, is best instanced in the thinking proper to mathematics and the physical sciences. In this chapter, Hegel portrays the laws of motion in physics. quote, wherein consciousness tries to grasp the essence of bodies relationally, yet exhibiting a certain conceptual indifference. Murray, with an important article on time and the phenomenology, explains that while motion gets defined relationally as a function of space and time, distance and velocity, the latter are thought to exist without essential dependence on each other, each as a separate difference, so that their unity might be typed indifference. And so Hegel writes, these parts, time and space, or distance and velocity, do not in themselves express this origin in a one. They are indifferent to one another. Space is thought of as able to be without time, time without space, and distance, at least, without velocity. And it's just worth pausing here to see how Hegel's philosophy actually coheres rather nice with Einstein's theory of relativity. Here, the special relativity. Now, force and understanding constitutes the last chapter on consciousness. And one of the key shifts in the phenomenology is when Hegel moves from consciousness in chapter 3 to self-consciousness in chapter 4. And it is here that time takes on a new dimension. Now, I'm going to skip over the first part of it. I'm going to move straight to the famous master-slave section. This was a section, incidentally, which is very important for Marx. Now, Murray writes, a new sense of time gets insinuated into the world, an historical time that prescribes not the motion of physical objects in space, but the movement of spirit in time. So we now see the necessary connection between concept and time. Hegel's conception of the concept is both ontological and temporal, so that the concept is not a main name, but a mode of existence, namely that of spirit's life, and is not an eternal eidos, but a temporal process of self-shapings. Now, at this point, I need to explain how Hegel uses the term concept, Begriff, because he uses it in a sense that we would not normally use. For Hegel, the concept is a formal, final cause of a thing, a formal, final cause of a thing. So the formal cause is the essence or nature of a thing, and the final cause is the purpose a thing attempts to realize. Now I'm going to move on to a section on what he calls the unhappy consciousness. And here the dialectic between the individual and what he says calls the unchangeable is cast in distinctly temporal terms. One way of understanding the unhappy consciousness is that it comes about if we focus primarily on the world beyond and come to see our world as evil or valueless. So for a Christian, one can say it is a stage one must go through, almost like Luther's idea that one must be condemned by the law before encountering the gospel. So Hegel writes of the frustration we as changeable experience in wishing to have union with the unchangeable, the divine. Quote, the hope of becoming one with the divine must remain a hope that is without fulfillment. By the nature of the immediately present unit, it necessarily follows that in the world of time, it has vanished, and that in space, it had a remote existence and remains utterly remote. So Murray comments, here we only need to note the operation of a time structure that is both static, so you've got the unchangeable, and dynamic, the consciousness, which is what virtually defines this stance of consciousness. Now, I need to stress, it may well be a mistake to call the divine the unchangeable. But as already stressed, in reading the phenomenology, one must always bear in mind that Hegel is studying the logic of appearances, and sometimes appearances deceive, and the assumptions we make are erroneous. So likewise, the unhappy consciousness may well be misguided, but this is how religious experience often functions. Having looked at passages in chapter 4, I'm now going to pass over the next chapter on reason. There's no explicit discussion of time here, although in sections 256 to 265, there's a section on teleology, which where, of course, time is implicit. And what I'm going to do is turn to chapter 6, which concerns spirit. As we've seen, spirit is a central concern of Hegel. This is not just concerned with the Holy Spirit, although this is a key to his understanding, but spirit is also an all-encompassing idea of Hegel's. And I need to say something more about it in order to understand his view of time in the later chapters of the phenomenology. At the very beginning of chapter 6, Hegel relates spirit to reason. So reason was the subject of the previous chapter. Quote, reason is spirit when its certainty of being all reality has been raised to truth, and it is conscious of itself as its own world and of the world as itself. Now, Scheckler, wrote a very good commentary on the phenomenology. He explains this as the subjective reason becoming transpersonal spirit when I realize there's a difference between my world and the world. Hence, we have a clear switch from the subjective idealism of Kant and Schopenhauer to the objective idealism of Hegel. So for Hegel, spirit is self-supporting, absolute, real being. All previous shapes of consciousness are abstract forms of it. Now, in chapter 7 on religion, Hegel argues that the three moments which occupy chapters 1 to 5, that's consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, are not temporal successive phrases, but rather their totality taken together constitutes spirit in its mundane existence generally. Hegel then makes his fundamental remarks about spirit and time, which I think constitute the key to his understanding of time. So again, this, as the other quotations on the handout, the course traversed by these moments is, in relation to religion, not to be represented as occurring in time. Only the totality of spirit is in time, and the shapes, which are shapes of the totality of spirit, display themselves in a temporal succession. For only the whole has true actuality, and therefore the form of pure freedom in face of an other, a form which expresses itself as time. That's the end of the quotation. The shapes of consciousness, self-consciousness, and reason, quote, exhibit spirit in its individuality or actuality and are distinguished from one another in time, though in such a way that the later moment retains within it the preceding one. Now, Murray suggests that there is something radically unsatisfactory about the in-time formulation. So in German, in der Zeit. So this is der Geist, der ganze Geist, nur ist in der Zeit, is in time. He writes that one could say a world moment is in time, meaning that it can be distinguished from some past moments and future moments that belong to it as it does to them. But the text expressly declares the whole of spirit is in time, which strictly makes no sense if nothing in principle could ever precede or succeed the whole. So, since Hegel wishes to affirm that both the stages and the totality of the stages are temporal, Murray suggests that Hegel wishes to say the whole must be expressed as time. So no need to get bogged down in this, but I think this is the essential point. One could therefore compare what he writes in the final paragraph of the phenomenology of spirit emptied out into time. So just to reiterate the point, spirit is not in time, but is as time. Now, the chapter on religion takes us through natural religion, religion in the form of art, and comes to a climax in revealed religion. It is revealed religion that advances the insight of the temporality of spirit. And we see this especially in the idea of the death of God. Now, despite the importance of this idea of the death of God, it's something too involved to consider today. But just to say, I addressed this last Monday at the Manchester Wagner Society, and this should appear on their website. And just to say, the easiest way of understanding Hegel's idea of the death of God is to work through Wagner's Ring Cycle. Now, this is 15 hours of music, but you need more than 15 hours to work through the phenomenology. So if you want to cheat and have a little, not spend 15 hours, you could just look at the second opera of the Cycle of the Valkyrie and the final opera, Twilight of the Gods. And the genius of Wagner is that he presents Hegel in a very digestible form. So one of the key ideas in Hegel, in fact, in the Lutheran tradition, is this idea of the death of God. But I'm sorry, we do not have time to look at that today. But what I do want to talk about is the centrality of the incarnation in Hegel's thoughts, and hence the quotation from Galatians 4:4 as the title of my talk. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son. And this is a text which Hegel quotes on a number of occasions and was clearly very important for him. Now, Hegel writes that absolute spirit has given itself implicitly the shape of self-consciousness, and therefore has also given it for its consciousness. This now appears as the belief of the world that spirit is immediately present as a self-conscious being, i.e., as an actual man, that the believer is immediately certain of spirit, sees, feels, and hears this divinity. And he then adds at the beginning of section 759, quote, "This incarnation of the divine being, or the fact that it essentially and directly has the shape of self-consciousness, is the simple content of the absolute religion." And just to add one striking aspect of Hegel's teaching on the incarnation is that, as I understand him anyway, Jesus Christ should be aware of his divinity. It's very interesting. And this is something many New Testament scholars do not wish to affirm. So we see how absolutely central the incarnation is to Hegel's view of time. Now, I want to consider the transition from chapter 7 to chapter 8. And sometimes people put this in the form of moving from religion to philosophy, and I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Because you still have religion, I think, in the final chapter. And here, consciousness turns into absolute knowing. Further, philosophy not only understands that being becomes self-conscious in human beings, but goes a stage further in saying that this being is absolute being, and so encompasses more than mere life and consciousness. And so Hegel writes, in this self-like form in which existence is immediately thought, the content is the concept, so the Begriff. And Stephen Houlgate concludes, philosophical consciousness thus understands the course of the world not just to be the deed of an alien satisfaction, but to be the work of the very rationality that it knows to be at work within itself. In this sense, philosophy sees in the world its own action as such. And so I now move to the final chapter, Absolute Knowing, where Hegel sets out his fundamental understanding of time. So he writes, time is the concept itself, and is there, and which presents itself to consciousness as empty intuition. For this reason, spirit necessarily appears in time, and it appears in time just so long as it has not grasped its pure concept, i.e., has not annulled time. So time is the outer intuited pure self, which is not grasped by the self, the merely intuited concept. When this latter grasps itself, it sets aside its time form, comprehends this intuiting, and is a comprehended and comprehending intuiting. Time, therefore, appears as the destiny and necessity of spirit that is not yet complete within itself. The necessity to enrich the share which self-consciousness has in consciousness, to set in motion the immediacy of the in itself, which is the form in which substance is present in consciousness. And just to say briefly, there appear to be two allusions here to Kant's critique of pure reason. And for purposes of time, I'm just going to skip that section. So if there is a problem with revealed religion, it is that the self is represented in terms of an external serialized time. The temporal self is not strictly grasped. When it is, then the deficient being in time view of time is annulled. And so Murray writes, spirit is no longer thought as intuited out there in time, but rather gets conceptually grasped as identical with time as time. The overcoming and supersession of the notion of spirit in time in favor of spirit as time is expressed in the formulation a comprehended and comprehending intuiting. And so in the close of phenomenology, spirit comes to know itself as nothing but time, which completely understood would be comprehended history, begriffene Geschichte. And Murray continues, it knows itself as time because spirit recognizes that the concept which is the medium of its life, is time. And so Hegel writes, this revelation is the concept's time, in that this externalization is in its own self externalized. And just as it is in its extension, that's Ausdehnung, so it is equally in its depth in the self. Now, I appreciate that Hegel is not easy to understand. And if you've got, say, 10% of what I've presented of Hegel, well, that is a start. I've tried my best to make his view of time in the phenomenology comprehensible. And if you're new to the phenomenology, do read it. It is not only crucial for understanding the history of philosophy and theology through the 19th and 20th century, but it is up there in the philosophical and theological stratosphere. Life is short, so carefully choose what you read. And I think certainly, I mean, for example, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, I think, is a must. I think the phenomenology is very important. Also, Hegel's Science of Logic, I mean, really one of the greatest works ever of philosophy and theology. And his view of time in the phenomenology started by asking quite mundane questions in sense certainty. But in fact, when it comes to the end of the phenomenology, it comes to a terrific climax. And I'll read this. Yes, it will only take 30 seconds. I'll just read it. It's not on the handout. And if you can't follow everything, don't worry. Just get one general sense. He says the spirit's preservation, and that spirits in the plural, regarded from the side of their free existence, appearing in the form of contingency, is history. But regarded from the side of the philosophically comprehended organization, it is the science of knowing in the sphere of appearance. The two together, comprehended in history, form alike the inwardizing and Golgotha of the absolute spirit, the actuality, truth, and certainty of his throne, without which he would be lifeless and alone. Only, when he quotes freely from Schiller, from the chalice of this realm of spirits, firms forth for him his own infinitude. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's great. We're having some questions coming. Please do type your questions for Richard. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, and then we're going to go to a final student paper for the morning. The question has come in, does not Christianity reduce time to now, so the crucifixion is before creation and also inside time?
Wow. Yes, that is such a good question. Obviously, in one sense, you know, the crucifixion is in time. You can date it to, you know, roughly AD 30 in Jerusalem. But I think, in a sense, it is so fundamental for how we view the world that, yeah, in a sense, it is non-temporal. And it's interesting that when Hegel talks about the death of God, it's not clear to me that he understands that as a temporal process. So I don't think he's simply restricting that to what happened in Jerusalem in AD 30, but it's got a more, almost like a non-temporal sense. And I mean, I didn't say this in the lecture, but one of the fundamental things about the death of God in Hegel is that it means that God now can live in our hearts. So for him, John's gospel is very important here. So you have the death of Christ, and then you have the giving of the Spirit. So almost, you know, the crucifixion, resurrection, Pentecost are very much telescoped, very much brought together. and one of the fundamental things is that because of this death of God, God can be at work in our hearts, yeah, as would speak through the Holy Spirit. And I suppose, I mean, I'm just thinking, I never thought about this, but, I suppose what does one say about spiritual experience before AD 30? So, I mean, that is such a good question. Thank you very much. And something I really need to go away and think about that a little bit more.
Thank you. While we wait for other questions to come in, Richard, perhaps you talk about Trinitarian theology in Hegel, because I'm wondering, as I'm listening to you, about how perhaps there's a conflation of logos and spirit in Hegel. I may be misunderstanding him. Would you help us to understand, logos Christology, spirit Christology, and maybe a kind of Trinitarian way of thinking about the relationship between these things? Is that something that Hegel helps us with? Because you talked about the spirit being incarnate. So could you help us understand the relationship between, logos in John, and then in Luke, of course, you've got the spirit coming upon Jesus. You've got a spirit Christology in Luke. So, and then, of course, the relationship between the spirit in John and Acts, etc. So would it be, I'd be interested just to get a sense of how Hegel's trying to, if he does, engage with Trinitarian thinking and the kind of categories that you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, certainly his theology is Trinitarian through and through. And this has been very much appreciated by, systematic theologians. I mean, just to say that, he was quite fundamental for people like Moltmann and Jungel. Also, Hans Kungel also died recently. He took an interest in Hegel and what he meant for Trinitarian theology. And I mean, for me, this is the great strength of Hegel, I think, that you're not talking about simply some naive view of monotheism. The idea that, in fact, when you look at Hegel's philosophy, sometimes the very structure of it is Trinitarian. So, for example, if you take the encyclopedia, this comes in 3 sections, and the first section is on logic, which in a sense you could say corresponds roughly, to God the Father. The second one is the philosophy of nature, which you could say relates to the second person of the Trinity. And what is very interesting is that when you go from the first part, logic, to the second part, that is where the idea of time is introduced. So when you're looking at the science of logic, for example, Hegel can talk about change without talking about time. But then when he does the transition to the second part on nature, he can then introduce the idea of time. And then the third part is the philosophy of mind, is almost like, relating to the Holy Spirit. So you do get this Trinitarian structure. Now, it's interesting that you talked about the Logos. It'd be interesting, again, to go back to Hegel and see how he does talk about the Logos. Because, of course, the Logos, that's from where we get our word logic. And in his encyclopedia, the logic, as I say, is if it's got a correspondence, it would seem to be with, God the Father. Just to stress again, I think this is relevant to your question, is that for Hegel, as I say, without the world, God is not God. And so his idea is that you cannot make a simple separation between God and the world. And of course, this is another reason why the incarnation is absolutely central for him. And again, you see, he describes the Christianity as the absolute religion. And that idea of the incarnation is quite fundamental.
I'm still waiting for some more questions to come in, so please do send in your
Yeah.
questions.
Perhaps whilst we're waiting for questions to come in, can I just say again, there are some works there on the bibliography. So there's Kant's, this is the translation I used, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Now, this is hard, and I'm not pretending it's easy, but again, this is in the stratosphere. A work I found very helpful for the Critique of Pure Reason is this guide by Sebastian Gardner. This is in the Routledge series. The translation I've used of the Phenomenology is this one translated by A.V. Miller. And then what I have here, this is Quentin Lauer, a reading of Hegel's Phenomenology. This is another work I've referred to in my talk. And if you want a general introduction to Hegel, well, apart from listening to the recital, this work by Stephen Houlgate, An Introduction to Hegel, is absolutely wonderful. In fact, the final chapter is called Philosophy and Christian Faith. Yeah, chapter 10. Great. And in this chapter, you have some of the best Christian theology I've ever read. So this is a philosopher writing. He happens to be a Christian and knows rather a lot about Hegel, but it's just a really wonderful introduction. So I know that the material I've presented today is very difficult. I don't pretend it's easy. I've come to Hegel rather late in life. I wish I had read Hegel earlier on, or read more of Hegel earlier on. So I just would encourage you to give him a go.
Thanks so much, Richard. We do have one question that's coming, which I think will be the final one for our session. And it picks up the Trinitarian question around personhood, and an article in which a statement was made that for Hegel, God is not to be thought of as personal, but as a process. The person asking the question asks, do you agree with this? And would this have some impact on a Trinitarian understanding if it's true? How do you respond to that, Richard?
Right, okay. If you look at chapter 7 of the Phenomenology, which concerns religion, and there's a section on, the revealed religion, on especially Christianity, he talks about picture thinking, which in German is Vorstellung, picture thinking. So when we talk about God the Father, we are using a picture of a father, and we use language which is inevitably mythological. Likewise, if you were to talk about Jesus dying as a sacrifice for our sin, that language is inevitably mythological. And when you're using mythological language, you are talking about God in terms of a person. And one of the hardest things I've found in the Phenomenology is moving from chapter 7, where you can talk about picture thinking, to the absolute knowing of the final chapter. And it may be that when you have that transition, that you are moving from the idea of God as a person to God as a process, possibly. Now, this is not, there's quite a lot of dispute about this, and there have been some works recently which have looked at the personhood of God in Hegel. So there's, I know that Stephen sorry, I know that, yes, Stephen Holgate has addressed this. And I'm not sure whether in Hegel God is presented as a person when you come to what he's doing in chapter. I mean, that is such a good question, such a good question. And you see, I think this is the fundamental question in theology. How do we relate our picture thinking of the phenomenology chapter 7 to the absolute knowing of chapter 8? In that transition, are we losing something? So are we losing something of the personhood of God? And it may be that this transition from chapter 7 to chapter 8 is like Bultmann's demythologizing. So you're moving from a world of myth to a demythologized theology. But that is such a good question, thank you. And you've really put your finger on something very important there.
Thank you. And then from my point of view, it brings us back into the whole question of analogical language.
Yeah.
I think that's an important kind of area to explore as we think about these categories. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for being with us, Richard. I think for many of us who are less familiar with Hegel, it has been an interesting and stimulating paper, and demanding for some of us, I'm sure, but we're really grateful that you have taken us through this material and given us so much to think about. And in fact, it relates in this particular research conference with issues around time. And we had the physicist Andrew Steen earlier talking about science and faith. And so it's I hope will feed into some conversations around the nature of time and how we think about time, both in terms of science and in terms of philosophy and theology. So thank you so much for your time being with us today. We're very, very grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been lovely talking to you. So stay safe, everybody. And it's been a real pleasure speaking about Hegel and time.
Thank you, Richard. So I'm going to invite Tim Chen to give a short paper. Tim is a student, a PhD student with us. And I'll say a little bit about Tim. We've got 30 minutes to finish our morning. We're back again tomorrow. And just to I'll talk about tomorrow after Tim's paper. But Tim Chen is from mainland China, and he is a pastor of a church there. And he's also preparing to teach in a seminary back in China. So he's part of a faculty in preparation team. He's also facilitates some publishing of Christian material through a publishing house based in Edinburgh and Latria Press, which is he's the general editor of. And so it's a delight really to have one of our own students giving a paper. And it's a shorter paper. It'll be about 20-25 minutes, and we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll finish. Tim's area of interest is spirit, wisdom and spirit Christology, and also Second Temple Judaism. And the title of his paper today is there a spirit wisdom in the wisdom of Solomon and Sirach? So thank you so much for being willing to give this paper today, Tim, and we look forward to hearing from you. So over to you. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your attention. So it's very interesting that our keynote speaker and Professor Bell, so both of them mentioned the spirit's work and the role. So now we turn to some ancient writings that in which the spirit's work and role is also the concern. So is there a spirit's wisdom in the wisdom of Solomon and Sirach? The rise of a biblical wisdom Christology and the problematic assumption. While Wellhausen and his followers overemphasized their historical approach to the texts of the Bible, wisdom literature was previously marginalized in Old Testament studies in modern biblical scholarship. Only since the 20th century, there had begun the revival of wisdom theology, which then impacts New Testament studies and the discussion of the Jesus tradition. and such an inference continues today. In his book, published in 1908, William Fairweather had already argued that the Hellenistic Jewish concept of wisdom overshadows the development of Christology in the New Testament. Randall Harris is the first scholar in modern biblical scholarship who evidently argued for the dependence of John's Gospel on Jewish wisdom literature. Due to Harris' remarkable achievement, Elizabeth Johnson rightly comments that ever since the publication of Harris' 1917 book, his thesis is unanimously accepted among Johannine scholars. It was then H.J. Lawler used the term wisdom Christology in his review of Harris' work, which was possibly the first appearance of this term in modern scholarship. Despite the increasing interest on the topic of wisdom Christology, the following discussions in the New Testament studies are often entangled by a Hellenistic understanding of the concepts of wisdom and the Spirit. During his studies on the wisdom sayings in the Q source, Robinson acknowledged that the construction of wisdom Christology in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke was significantly influenced by the Hellenistic Jewish Christian milieu. He then uncritically picked up the assumption of the identification between wisdom and the Spirit in his arguments. It is obviously not Robinson alone who adopted this assumption in discussions of wisdom Christology in the Synoptics. The same position was adopted in discussions of Johannine with wisdom Christology. In addition, when talking about wisdom Christology in the Pauline letters, the same problem persists. In the following part, we shall see that an equation between wisdom and the Spirit is chiefly caused by a Hellenistic reading of the wisdom of Solomon. It is neither faithful to the book itself nor to Jewish writings throughout the ages. Studies on the wisdom of Solomon affirm the evident influence from Stoicism in this book, as some vocabulary and phrases show. However, a careful reading of those ambiguous passages demonstrates that the wisdom of Solomon did not facilitate a new development of wisdom theology through identifying wisdom as a spirit. Besides those verses from the wisdom of Solomon, other passages from Second Temple Jewish literature, including Sirach, need also to be clarified. Wisdom and the Spirit in Second Temple Jewish literature. There is, in fact, a long scholarship of reading the wisdom of Solomon against a Stoic background and consequently equating wisdom with the Spirit as a theological conclusion. Although Clement of Alexandria had already pointed out the mistake of the Stoics in confusing God with wisdom and the Stoic spirit in their reading of Wisdom 7:24, the same mistake continues today. Back in 1913, in his reading of this book, R.H. Charles had already articulated such an equation between wisdom and the Spirit based on Wisdom 1:4-7, 9:17, Sirach 24:3, and the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah 85. This is a position that most scholars have adopted in modern scholarship. However, in these texts, there is no more than the superficial equation of wisdom and the Spirit. The verses of Wisdom 1:7, 9:17, and 12:1 are often cited by scholars to establish the identification of wisdom with the Spirit in the Wisdom of Solomon, as R.H. Charles did. However, both in 1:7 and 9:17, the Spirit is identified as the Spirit of the Lord. Even in 12:1, from the following verse, 12:2, the Spirit here is the Spirit of the Lord as well. Reading Wisdom 1:6, 7:7, verses 23-24, which Withrington uses to vindicate a Pauline wisdom Christology in 1 Corinthians 1-4, pneuma Sophia's genitive form in verse 7, and MRT pneuma in 7:22, both indicate that the Spirit belongs to and is in wisdom. Similarly, What Witrington confirms is not the identification of wisdom with the Spirit, but that the Spirit of wisdom is also the Spirit of the Lord. However, before arriving at a conclusion, there is the most confusing verse, Wisdom 1:6, which reads that wisdom is a kindly spirit. Besides Wisdom 1:6, Wisdom 7:25 and Sirach 24:3-4 are two other texts scholars usually cite as supporting evidence for a spiritual reading of wisdom. In these two texts, wisdom is described as a breath coming directly from the mouth of the Lord, reminiscent of the Spirit. All these three texts require close and careful reading. Turning to the Qumran literature, personified wisdom is hinted at in 4Q 185, 4Q 525, and 11Q PS. Collins also notes that the mystery in the Book of Mysteries might indicate a personified figure as Lady Wisdom. Again, there is no suggestion or any equation of wisdom with the Spirit in these texts. In 1QS, 4Q299, and 4Q300, wisdom is often described as hidden. Menzies notes specifically that according to 1QS and 1QH, the wisdom of God is only available to humankind through being illuminated by the Spirit, a heavy influence from the apocalyptic wisdom tradition, as Bannerman indicates. Apart from the Qumran literature, R.H. Charles declared that wisdom is identical with the Spirit in the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah 85. However, leaving alone the difficult question of dating, as an interpretation of Genesis 38:26, the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah 85 only states that Solomon's wisdom is granted by the Holy Spirit. In Bereshit Rabbah, personified wisdom is more associated with the Torah. Therefore, as being previously mentioned, Wisdom 1:6, Wisdom 7:25, and Sirach 24:3-4 remain as the three most complicated texts that require careful investigation. Complicated texts in the Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach. This section focuses on Wisdom 1:6, Wisdom 7:25, and Sirach 24:3-4, which are the most complicated texts regarding wisdom's relationship with the Spirit. Analyzing the phrases and the vocabularies that cause ambiguities in translation, this article argues that the accepted translations of Wisdom 1:6, Wisdom 7:25 render the original text in a problematic way. Putting Sirach 24:3-4 back into its Jewish theological setting also shows that Sirach created not an alien understanding of wisdom to other Jewish writings. Despite the significant developments of wisdom theology as reflected in these two books, neither the Wisdom of Solomon nor Sirach directly adopted Hellenistic concepts of wisdom and the Spirit. A re-evaluation of wisdom theology in the Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach is required. Wisdom 1:6 and the apposition of Pneuma and Sophia. A close reading of Wisdom 1:6 within its context does not support the statement that wisdom is a spirit. The KJV Apocrypha, originally published in 1611, reads the text as wisdom is a loving spirit. Charles translated this verse into wisdom is a spirit that loves man, and the NRSV version puts it as wisdom is a kindly spirit. But according to the Septuagint text of Wisdom 1:6, it is difficult to tell in the phrase philanthropos gar pneuma sophia whether pneuma or sophia should be the subject. Both words are nominative in Greek here. However, when due attention is paid to the context of verse 6, this verse places more meaning on pneuma than sophia. Firstly, looking at 1:5-8, as the context of verse 6, while the subject in verse 5 is a holy and disciplined spirit, in verses 7-8, the subject is the Spirit of the Lord. Therefore, it is more feasible for pneuma to be the subject of verse 6, all the more so because pneuma stands ahead of Sophia and is closer to the adjective philanthropos. Secondly, verse 6 addresses things that happened to human souls, which also indicates its strong connection with the spirit rather than wisdom. Reading together with chapter 1, verse 4, it is clear that the following discussion of verses 5 to 8 is located in human souls. Daily Stone rightly comments that as in 12.1, here in verse 6, spirit is regarded as a universal immanent principle existing within human beings. Thirdly, throughout the entire book, while wisdom is somehow hypostasized, the spirit of wisdom is considered more as a context between humankind and the divine. And fourthly, a Jewish understanding of the spirit differs significantly from the Hellenistic view. Despite similarities between the pneuma in the Wisdom of Solomon and in the Stoics, Gilbert states that the wisdom pneuma, a Jewish pneuma, has divine implications that Stoic materialism could not accept. It is not because of the text itself, but probably the identical relationship between pneuma and the logos in Greek philosophy that scholars are tempted to make a similar judgment in the Wisdom of Solomon. Returning to Wisdom 1.6, the completed concurrence of two nominatives, the phrase pneuma sophia, is what is termed apposition in grammar. The word sophia is an appositive to pneuma here. According to Wallace, the use of appositives indicates assumption but not assertion. Appositive is different from the predict nominative. Therefore, the translation wisdom is spirit does not fit well with Greek grammar and even destroys the apposition here intended by the author. The appositive may refer to the same person or things as the first noun. However, it might also be a clarification, description, or identification of the previous noun. Therefore, Blake considered appositive as the modifier. Blake stated that in Semitic, it is possible for either noun in apposition to be the modifier or the other, but the second noun most often serves as a modifier denoting class, quality, material, or content of the first. When the author of the Wisdom of Solomon wrote this book, the phrase pneuma sophia probably resembled the Hebrew phrase huach chokhmah in Exodus 28:3, Deuteronomy 34:9, and Isaiah 11:2. Additionally, in the Septuagint, pneumatos sophias, nouns in genitive form in Exodus 28:3, is an exact example of apposition as in Wisdom 1.6. Therefore, being consistent with the rest of this book, pneuma sophia in Wisdom 1.6 should be translated into the spirit of wisdom. Wisdom 1.6 thus should be better read as, for the spirit of wisdom is gracious, yet she will not exonerate the blasphemers from the words out of his lips, because God is a witness of his innermost, a true inspector of his heart, and a hearer of his tongue. Wisdom 7.25 and the breath of God. Wisdom 7.25 is the second of the most complicated three texts to look at. In this verse, in an English translation, wisdom is described as a breath of the power of God. But the Greek term for breath here is Artemis, which should be literally translated as vapor or smoke, but not breath. The same Greek word also appears in Plato's Timaeus and Aristotle's Meteorologica. However, while Plato used this word to describe how the vapor of the humus forms human souls, Aristotle used the same word to describe the exhalation of what is moist. Although both Plato and Aristotle used this term in a metaphysical way, They only used it to explain formations that happen in the physical world. In contrast to Plato and Aristotle, the author of the Wisdom of Solomon used this term in a totally different way. He used it in its Jewish theological context to describe wisdom's divinity as having a close relationship with God. Examining the way Artemis is used in the Septuagint as well as in the New Testament, it is not difficult to judge that Artemis in 725 should be literally translated as smoke, especially in the setting of a fire or sacrifice. In terms of Artemis, the closest verses to Wisdom 725 in the Septuagint are Sirach 38:28 and 43, verse 4, while Sirach 38:28 adopts this term to describe the power of the breath of fire. In 43, verse 4, it is used again to depict the fiery vapors of the sun. This is exactly what Wisdom 725 intends to express. As Artemis, wisdom is the extension of God's power towards this world. When Wisdom 725 describes wisdom as a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty, the writer also utilizes the metaphor of the sun to indicate the excellency of God. But surely, the glory of wisdom and the Lord is far superior to the sun, according to Wisdom 7:29. However, despite the nuances in meaning, the English translation breath still has merits worth preserving. First, analogically, this word depicts wisdom as the action of God, provided we clearly know that breath here is wisdom, but not the spirit of wisdom. Second, the word breath also theologically reads the action of wisdom as inseparable from the spirit of wisdom or the spirit of the Lord, which is intended by the author. Sirach 24:3-4 and the mist from on high. We have seen that the author of the Wisdom of Solomon by no means intended to equate wisdom with the spirit. Sirach 24:3-4 is the last of the three most complicated texts. Compared to Wisdom 1:6 and 7:25, Sirach 24:3-4 is much less confusing. While wisdom here is described as coming from the mouth of the Most High, who covered the earth like a mist, Wisrington relates this quotation here with Genesis 1:1-2 to argue that wisdom is a huach of the Lord. However, despite their judgment of the identification of wisdom and the spirit in the Wisdom of Solomon, Collins and Purdue do not see Sirach 24:3-4 as a similar case. Purdue denotes that describing wisdom as coming from the mouth of God in Sirach 24:3-6 is a metaphor of God's speaking reality into existence. Such an expression stands in line with Genesis chapter 1:1-2, chapter 2:4a, and Psalm 33. Additionally, Collins puts Sirach 24:3 together with Wisdom 7:25-26 as texts that both vindicate wisdom's divinity. In Sirach 24:3-4 and also 1:9-10, we see a wisdom theology consistent with Proverbs 2:6 and Psalm 33:6. While God's wisdom or word is normally regarded as the acting agent, the Spirit is the cooperating agent, as Psalm 33:6 indicates. Assessment and conclusion. Concerning the relationship between wisdom, word, and the spirit, Dilly Stone's opinion back in 1948 is still very appropriate. The identification of wisdom with the spirit in reading the Wisdom of Solomon is doubtful. He commented that there are overlaps between the concepts of wisdom, word, and the spirit in Second Temple Jewish literature. But there is still more to say about Dilly Stone's comments. What seem to be overlaps to Dilly Stone come from his Hellenistic point of view. Dilly Stone still confused wisdom with the spirit in the Wisdom of Solomon. Based on the above investigations, the relationship between wisdom and the spirit might be mutual rather than identical in the Wisdom of Solomon and the Sirach. Such a mutual relationship is not from, yet also should not be confused by Hellenistic ideas. A further development of wisdom theology in the Wisdom of Solomon is undeniable, but in terms of its perspective of wisdom and the spirit, this book is still in line with other Jewish wisdom writings. The mutual relationship between wisdom and the spirit is also consistent with the same relationship to God's word and God's spirit that occasionally occurs in the Old Testament. While God's word could hardly be considered as hypostasis of God, the mutual relationship between word and the spirit culminates in Jewish wisdom literature and most significantly in the wisdom of Solomon. Gilbert indicates that wisdom in Sirach, and especially in the wisdom of Solomon, are as pervasive as the spirit. Gilbert thus uses the word assimilate, approximate, to describe the overlaps between the concepts of wisdom, spirit, and logos in the wisdom of Solomon. Roy Lasdam used a stronger word than Gilbert by saying that the wisdom of Solomon transferred the functions of spirit to wisdom, while it is undeniable that the cosmic yet imminent role of wisdom is reinforced in the wisdom of Solomon. It is still important to see that Proverbs had already introduced both the cosmic and imminent role of wisdom. Wisdom cheerfully joined God's work of creation, yet she is also rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighted in the human race. Regarding the role of the spirit, according to the book of Job, there already existed an imminent yet pervasive pneumatology, which is not necessarily to be ascribed to the Stoicism. Wisdom in Job is not apart from God, and the same is the spirit of wisdom. When Job 26:13 and Psalm 33:6 are read together with Job 34:14-15 and Psalm 104:29, it testifies that the same spirit sustains and holds all God's creation in its totality. In terms of the spirit's relationship with human understanding, Job provides both creational and functional illustrations. Job 33:4 explains that God's spirit creates human beings and the breath of the Almighty grants life. Job 32:8 then explicates that it is the spirit of humankind which is inspired by the breath of the Almighty that causes human understanding. Based on Job 32:8, Leviathan concludes, the spirit given at birth was considered no less divine, no less the spirit of God, than the spirit understood as a subsequent charismatic endowment. Job 34:14-15 then affirms that all flesh would perish without God's spirit and breath. Collins rightly comments that the wisdom of Solomon has a strong cosmology which is not seen in other wisdom writings. But again, the cosmic role of wisdom and the spirit is already rooted in Jewish wisdom literature, but not in the Stoics. So the final part is just conclusion. So since time is very close, so I think so I can just go without it. Yeah. So it's finished. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Tim, for your paper. I'm just waiting for some questions to come in. While I wait, please do. We've got 5 minutes or so for questions, so please do send a question through if you would like to do that. In terms of my own sort of reading of this, I suppose as I was listening to you, Tim, I was thinking to myself, so what would be the implications of this Second Temple discussion in relation, obviously, to Old Testament texts, but what about some of the wisdom Christology that we find in the New Testament and also the pneumatology? What would you say would be the implications of this reading for some of the New Testament authors who might have, who would have been familiar with some of this background? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so definitely the New Testament books are written in the Jewish Christian context. So how those early writers, they understood the relationship between wisdom and the spirit. So it's very significant to the early writings in the New Testament. As we realize that we nowadays talk a lot about pneumatology and Christology, especially the relationship between Christ and the Spirit very significantly in the Gospel of John. But because of a Hellenistic understanding of the Jewish background, so some biblical scholars just go to the conclusion that wisdom is a spirit. But we see, so such an identification is not faithful to John itself and also to the Jewish Christian theology. So, so we know, so in later development in church history, there is Gnosticism. So there is identification between wisdom and the spirit. I mean, so consequently, Christ and the spirit. So, I mean, so at least we need to be aware of the relationship. So not only to be faithful to the New Testament books, but also to be aware of the dangers in church history. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any thoughts about Paul on this one? I mean, if you were to think about some of the Pauline texts that might draw on this material, do any come to mind as well as the Johannine material?
Yeah. So my research is on Johannine materials. So
Okay.
yeah. So I just talk a lot about that in my PhD thesis. But there is indeed also Pauline wisdom Christology, especially in 1 Corinthians. So Paul just wrote that Christ is the wisdom of God. So there is a type of wisdom Christology also in Pauline letters. But so far, according to my research, so because I focus on the Gospel of John, and I also realized that Pauline wisdom Christology is very, it was articulated in a very different way, so other than John. But I think their foundation, I mean, their Jewish Christian contexts, so both of the authors, they didn't confuse wisdom with the spirit. Yeah, I don't know if I answered this question properly.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. Well, thanks so much, Tim, for giving us a taste of the work that you're doing in Wisdom Christology and John. Grateful for that, and I wish you every blessing in your studies and the research going forward, so thank you.
Thank you.
Just as we close today, we start again tomorrow at 9:30, but just to give you a bit of a taster, so tomorrow we're going to be have an opportunity to hear from somebody called Dr. Grant Massam, who has connections with LSD, has been involved in the life of the institution, and he is going to present a paper on secularization, modernization, and the local church. So a somewhat different kind of approach to what we've been hearing today. And then Professor Tony Lane, who is a very well-known colleague, worked here for many, many years, and has an interest at the interface of science and theology. And he's going to be giving a paper, a rather provocative and interesting title, Christian Faith and Extraterrestrial Intelligence. So that is something that I think will be very interesting. And then at the end, we're going to have a plenary session with Andrew Steen again. Andrew's going to join us. So if you have any more questions for Andrew, I know we didn't get through all the questions that were raised today. Please, we can try and pick some of those up again, but also if you have any further questions for Andrew, we're going to pull it all together and begin to try to close the conference by engaging perhaps in a broader conversation around science and theology, science and faith. That would be really, really good. So thank you to everybody today for participating. Thank you for coming and watching us. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 9:30. So until then, it's goodbye from me. Bye-bye.